So I have just muted, but I also want to make sure if there's a thumbs up that you can still hear me. Thumbs up. Thank you,
Yes.
Nadri. Yeah, so I have to continue to mute. We are going to use the chat. Any questions that you have or any comments, but I want to hand it over to Professor Najri Mathis Rutledge. Najri Rutledge is a legal expert, professor, judge, writer, and former prosecutor. As a graduate of Spelman College and Harvard Law School, she serves as an opinion columnist for USA Today and is a tenured professor at South Texas College of Law, Houston. And today she's going to talk to us, among other topics, about Beyond Normalizing Racism, a call to action. Thank you so much, Professor.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much. So extreme violent racism is what most people think about when we use the term racism. As a result, diversity discussions are sometimes difficult because people assume that it's a platform to label all people as either active in the civil rights movement or KKK members without recognizing everyone in between. Bias affects all of us, even me. I have taken implicit bias tests and have been shocked and embarrassed by some of the results. In fact, just this weekend, the New York Times had an article that highlighted the tensions and biases between Blacks and Asian Americans. Bias is definitely not just a white-Black construct. Moreover, racism is not limited to murder or extreme examples. I'm going to focus on anti-Black racism because that is my personal experience. Let me get my slide. All right, so I'm going to discuss both extreme, obvious racism and more subtle forms of daily racism and microaggressions, and conclude with a call for action. Now, this is a picture of my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, Mama Rutledge is what I call her, remembers when she got a phone call that some white boys had taken her cousin, who was nicknamed Toe, to the woods and dragged him. Other details would be filled in later through the national news. The family members remembers Toe as a man who loved music, who loved playing dominoes, and loved his children. Toe knew that he was in fact a talented musician, and he said he would someday put Jasper, Texas on the map. He succeeded, but not in the way that any of us would have imagined. The world knew him as James Byrd Jr., the victim of one of the most horrific hate crimes in the nation's modern history by 3 white supremacists. Now, I'm sure all of us can agree that what happened to James Byrd Jr. was wrong, horrific, and evil. Racism is evil. For some, the term racism refers to some abstract idea from the past that is overused. For others, racism is an evil that must be dealt with every single day. Now, in spite of the Oklahoma shooting, the Oklahoma bombing, the Charleston church shooting, and what happened to the Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh, and other violent incidents by white supremacists, a large segment of the country does not see white supremacy as a threat or seeks to minimize the threat. It certainly is easier to categorize all the hate-filled incidents as isolated matters that don't reflect society. Virginia, do me a favor, will you mute a little?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. One only needs to consider the history of racial terror in this country to know that this issue goes much deeper than isolated incidents.
After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. Formerly enslaved people were promised land and opportunity, but most got nothing because America quickly devolved into an era of racial terrorism and oppression for black citizens. White people in the South were angry that people formerly considered property were now equal citizens. Many turned to violence. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of black people were murdered when they tried to claim their rights. Soon afterwards, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending a brief period of racial progress known as Reconstruction. Nationwide resistance to racial equality resulted in the reestablishment of racial subordination through biased laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism, most dramatically enforced through lynchings. Racial terror lynchings of black people defined a shameful era in America. These lynchings differed from the hanging of white people in places where there was no functioning criminal justice system. Racial terror lynchings were directed at all black people. They enforced compliance with racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and ensured racial segregation and denial of equal rights. In 1916, in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, a young black man named Jeff Brown accidentally bumped into a white woman while running to catch a train. A white mob stopped him and lynched him, beating him and then hanging him from a tree for his insolence and carelessness. His public murder was not about criminal punishment, but was instead about maintaining racial hierarchy and terrorizing the black community. White town residents proudly sold photographs of Mr. Brown's brutalized body hanging from the tree for 5 cents each. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented.
Okay, so terrorizing black communities has been happening since the 1800s with lynching. Black men, women, and children were hung from trees, shot, stabbed, sometimes burned alive, sometimes castrated for committing crimes like being, quote, uppity, because using the word damn when Anthony Crawford demanded that he be paid a fair price for his cotton, or like Elizabeth Lawrence, a black school teacher and mother who scolded white children for throwing rocks and dirt at her. In the case of Ms. Lawrence, the children's parents formed a mob that murdered Mrs. Lawrence and set her house on fire. Despite the more than 4,000 people who were murdered through lynching, which was by all accounts a form of entertainment, where children were present, food and mementos were sold, and members of law enforcement and politicians were present, there have been over 200 attempts to pass federal anti-lynching legislation starting in 1882 in this country. None of it has ever passed, ever. In 2021, the fact that white supremacists and insurrectionists built not a symbolic but a sturdy noose during the failed insurrection attempt as they waved Confederate flags, wore Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts and other anti-Semitic clothing, and yelled racial slurs towards the black members of the Capitol Police was not a coincidence, and it was not isolated. The distinction in how the insurrectionists were treated compared to the peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters over the summer is yet another illustration of racism and bias at work. The constant downplaying of white supremacy is putting us in peril. Over the last decade, studies have shown far-right white extremists are responsible for more murders since September 11 than any other extremist group. The American people cannot afford to underestimate the evil of white supremacy. Now, there's a saying that if you dance with the devil, eventually you're going to get burned. Political parties have been flirting with racist ideas before the infamous Willie Horton political ad. Extreme white supremacist groups are organized, motivated, and deadly. The merging of disgruntled Americans with white supremacist groups is both a recruiting dream and a recipe for disaster. The problems gripping our nation is not limited to the rise of white supremacy. There are also problems of institutionalized and systemic racism, including housing discrimination, redlining, the war on drugs for people turning to crack cocaine, which has resulted in staggering prison rates, versus treating OxyContin abuse as a health crisis. The white supremacists who killed my husband's relative passed a note to each other that was confiscated. The note read, "We made history and shall die proudly remembered." To this day, Toe's gravesite is surrounded by a fence because it has been repeatedly vandalized over the years. Now, many of us have been conditioned to believe that racism means extreme violent racism, like what happened to James Byrd, While being exposed to stories of Blacks being brutalized by white supremacists or the police is traumatic, most of us are impacted by those stories and videos indirectly. What is more common and insidious is the daily racism and microaggressions. Microaggressions or racial microaggressions is defined as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Those who inflict racial microaggressions are often unaware that they have done anything to harm another person. Racism and bias impacts what towns we stop at during road trips, our interactions with the police, what doctors we see, how we style our hair, or even how I raise my child. Some people have a hard time understanding why microaggressions are a big deal, because in isolation, they may not sound like earth-shattering experiences. It's important to remember that it's not the individual moment, it's the context of a lived experience. It may sound like not that big of a deal, but it's not based on a single experience. Consider a mosquito bite. If one mosquito bites me, I'm annoyed, but it's not that big of a deal. But if I have 10 mosquito bites, I'm miserable. That's what microaggressions are like. It's a repetitive nature that makes it so bad, not the singular experience. Let me give you an example from my own life, or an example or two. I love being told that I'm articulate or that I'm a credit to my race, as if it's a shock or surprise that I can put two sentences together. Now, I also understand that some people say that I'm being hypersensitive by feeling that way. And what on earth is wrong with commenting or complimenting someone on their speech or presentation? Well, it's that kind of backhanded comment that also suggests that the author of the comment assumes that I am somehow special because other minorities are not articulate. Now, I didn't just reach that conclusion immediately. It's based on the context of my own lived experience. I also remember when I was working for a temp job, I was very good at typing, and I was trying to save money before heading off to Harvard Law School. I was at a small company and they had an in-house attorney. The attorney heard that I was going to law school in a few weeks, so she asked me where I was going. I told her Harvard. She had the audacity to correct me with a smirk. She said in her Southern accent, "You mean Howard, dearie?" No, I mean Harvard. Now, did the woman really mean anything by correcting me? Who knows? But in the context of my lived experience, her assumption that I could not possibly be admitted to an Ivy League school was based on bias. Now, I said that part of the problem with microaggressions are the frequency and the lived context. Let's talk about the lived context of those in the Black community. One clear example that has impacted the community is the police. We can't have a discussion about racism without raising the tense relationship between law enforcement and the Black community. I want to start by sharing a brief clip about Alex Lando.
We never talked about race growing up. I just don't think that was ever a conversation.
I thought that love would conquer all and skin color really didn't matter. I had to learn the really hard way when they almost killed you.
Yeah. I was 19 years old. I had picked up a friend, and I noticed that we had red and blue lights behind us. We were being pulled over. The officer explained I had made an illegal left turn and to step out of the car. So I get out of the car first. He pats me down, and then he goes around to the passenger side and pulls my friend Addison out of the car.
Addison is white.
Yeah, Addison is white. and he had some weed in his coat pocket. So he gets placed in handcuffs. I figure that everything's okay. I'm not in handcuffs. I've already been patted down. Plus, there's 3 officers on the scene. And I had never had a negative interaction with police in my life. So I asked them, can I please see a warrant before you continue the search? And they grabbed me and began to hit me in the face. I could hear Addison in the background yelling, stop, leave him alone. I was hit several times, and I remember gasping for air and spitting and blood flying across the grass. And then I hear an officer shout out, he's reaching for a gun. I immediately started yelling, no, I'm not. I'm not reaching for anything. And I remember an officer say, if he doesn't calm down, we're going to have to shoot him. I could feel the gun pressed to my head. I expected to be shot. And at that point, I lost consciousness. I woke up to a multitude of officers just standing around me laughing. One officer was like, where's that warrant now, you f***ing nigger? It took 45 stitches to close up the lacerations in my face alone. How did it feel when you finally saw me?
All I remember is involuntarily screaming.
That was the first time I had cried the entire time I had been in there. And it wasn't my injuries that hurt. It was just seeing how it devastated you.
My whole worldview changed that night.
Yeah. For me, it was the point of awakening to how the rest of the world is going to look at you. I was just another black face in the streets. And I was almost another dead black male.
So just by telling me in the chat, how many of you think Lando's story was an isolated incident, or is this commonplace? I'm just curious, and we'll go back to that later. But how many of you think that this is just an isolated incident, one of those bad apples, or is this more common? See quite a few people saying, sadly, it's common. Sadly, it's definitely not an isolated incident. This is becoming a very sad and troubling narrative. Black Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be shot by the police than white Americans. Unarmed Blacks are killed at a rate 1.3 times higher than the average. Knowing that Black lives are somehow disposable is painful. We hear about police shootings, but we don't hear about the routine harassment under stop and frisk laws.
What? Yo!
So that slide is disturbing, but it's something that happens on a regular basis, and it almost never makes the news. Being constantly stopped, sometimes thrown to the ground, questioned, and then ultimately released because no drugs are found, isn't necessarily newsworthy. In New York, 2 multi-million-dollar class action lawsuits were settled. They found that between the years of 2004 to 2012, almost 4.5 million people were impacted by aggressive Terry stops. And this is an example of stop and frisk under Terry versus Ohio. 88% were completely innocent of any wrongdoing. So it doesn't matter if you're wearing a nice suit that day. It doesn't matter if your children are with you, if it's raining outside when they ask you to step out of your car. It doesn't matter if you're thrown to the ground. All of that under the law is legal. The problem is all of us are not treated the same. Even worse, it's starting to become widely accepted that Blacks are not treated the same, but that knowledge hasn't led to real change. Last month, Rodney Reese, a young man who worked late at Walmart, was walking home during the winter storm, which included snow in his area. Some neighbors called police because they determined he looked suspicious or a threat, or maybe they just thought he needed help. The police stopped him and he asked him, did he need anything? His goal was just to go home without being harassed. And he said, no, I'm just going home. I don't need anything. Now, under the law, a voluntary encounter with law enforcement, that's completely lawful. As long as the law says the person has the right not to engage the police. So if the police just come up to you and say, hey, can I have your name? If you have the right to walk away, that's just a voluntary encounter. In order to stop and detain someone, you have to have what's known as reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Now, rather than acknowledge that Mr. Reese was doing nothing wrong, they arrested him and placed him in jail. Even though the charges were dropped, the arrest itself creates a record. You may also recall the picture to the left. This was a family of Black females going to treat themselves to get their nails done. The police, in response to a stolen motorcycle from a different state, decided to stop this SUV because the police said, well, the license plate numbers were similar. Now remember, the plates were from different states and they were looking for a motorcycle. Now the police could have questioned the occupants while they remained in the vehicle, or they could have asked the female adult to step out of the car. The decision to get the children out of the car, forcing them to lie face down on the concrete and handcuff them, was extreme. The 6-year-old was not handcuffed because she escaped being handcuffed, not because the officers came to their senses and realized that she didn't pose a threat, but because the handcuffs fell off of her. Ultimately, the family was not arrested and allowed to leave, but the scars from this traumatic incident remain. This ties back to the issue of how the police define dangerousness. Individuals are exposed to this type of aggressiveness and hostility even though they are unarmed, which indicates that it's not the weapon that may make them dangerous, but their very essence as a Black person. The problem with this story is that all persons, regardless of race, are not subjected to this type of behavior. I would dare say that every Black person has personally or has a loved one who personally has had a negative interaction with the police. Now, I personally have never had a negative interaction, but my husband has, and my mother has, and so have countless friends. The problem of the tense relationship between the police and the Black community is not about isolated incidents, but a history that we don't have time to explore. But that lived experience has certainly impacted perspectives. The various incidents of unlawful police violence have become so common that we have normalized that too, and have become desensitized to it. Interactions with the police is not the only time race can come to play. It can come to play when seeking medical help. I have several relatives who are physicians, and they are well aware of the disparate treatment Black patients receive, and studies are beginning to show the problem. If I decide to sell my house or apply for a loan, and the paperwork asks for my race, I can't help but wonder if, again, race will be an issue in the valuation of my home, as the couple highlighted in the New York Times article this summer. Even when I was applying for jobs, I had to consider taking my braids out of my hair just in case it was taken the wrong way. Now, my husband is African American. He has green eyes, like his mother, but neither of them are biracial, and we both have a light brown skin tone, which poet Caroline Randall Williams powerfully describes as rape-colored in her op-ed for the New York Times. Our very appearance is a constant reminder of our ancestors' American experience, included the violence of slavery. Whether I experience it directly through individuals or indirectly through oppressive systems, racism constantly seeks to attack my peace and the peace of countless others. Sadly, it often succeeds. Minimizing the daily abusive reality of people of color is in many ways more corrosive to the ideas of equality and harder to eliminate than the violent extremes. Racism is a disgraceful part of the American fabric. Its pervasiveness has made it seem normal. The normalization of racism produces a powerful facade of acceptability, even to its victims. Last summer, a white colleague and friend asked me if I had ever personally experienced racism. I was taken aback by the question, but even more taken aback by what came out of my mouth. I responded, no. Shortly after the conversation, I found myself angry. I thought I was angry at her, but realized I was really angry at myself. Why on earth did I equate the absence of violent racism directed towards me personally as not personally experiencing racism? Dealing with racism is so ingrained in my life that it was deniable precisely because I had normalized it. As a Black female law professor, I often feel like I'm walking an invisible tightrope, carefully avoiding any misstep for fear of falling. I walk a daily tightrope where I must appear as though all is well, despite the barrage of images of unarmed Blacks being killed, racist attacks, and the growth of white supremacy. Even the academy fails to provide a haven from racist attitudes. As sociologist Ellen Berry explained, diversity has become a form of symbolic politics to reconcile a contradiction. Institutions don't want to be portrayed as racist, but there is little desire to actually change systemic racism. As the editors in volume 2 of their groundbreaking book, To Be a Woman said, to be a woman of color in academia is too often to be presumed incompetent. My career as a law professor has spanned 17 years. In those 17 years, I have probably served on some diversity committee 15 of those years. Now, the work of diversity and inclusion is noble, but the fruitfulness is always tied back to the institution and administrators. Is diversity and inclusion an idea that institution is committed to, or is it just empty rhetoric or a marketing spin that makes it sound like we're achieving something? Part of being a Black academic means doing significant, time-consuming, and uncompensated service. It's true, Black women, like myself, are hard workers, but we are often asked to do extra work for free. Uncompensated service may include serving as a magnet for all minority students who want a mentor, and non-minority students who want a mentor of color. Service may include serving as an advisor for the various affinity groups, a chair or member of the diversity committee, and countless panels and speeches if there's a hot topic in the news or a special program focus. All of this is on top of the normal responsibilities of being an academic. There is a misperception that racism does not impact successful or educated people, but only those who are uneducated or have a low socioeconomic status. Every day in my life and the lives of other minorities, I have to decide how to react to daily slights and microaggressions. Do I say something and risk being labeled as a stereotype, the angry Black woman? Or do I speak up and potentially risk more? When you speak up, you are taking the risk of being not labeled not only as angry, but as threatening or ungrateful. If you are viewed as a troublemaker, you may be ostracized, disciplined, denied tenure and promotion, and silenced. And if you decide to say nothing at all, are you complicit? It's very much a tightrope. Now, I do love teaching and mentoring students, all students, regardless of their race or gender. As a Black female law professor, I must teach my students to review the law objectively. When race is germane, I have to have the courage to raise it. And when it's not, I have to have the courage to go against popular assumptions and raise that as well. Sometimes I even have to defend my choice to not discuss race or to take a viewpoint that is contrary to the viewpoint that has been embraced by the Black community. I must serve as a role model without favoring my minority students, although I vividly remember being in their shoes. I know what it's like to sit in class when a controversial case about race comes up in property, contracts, constitutional, or criminal law. As a professor, when the topic of race is raised, I have to cautiously navigate, giving my minority students the freedom to speak and the freedom to remain silent, knowing that few people embrace the burden of serving as a mouthpiece for an entire race. The entire thing can be quite exhausting. One would think that if racism is normalized, it cannot hurt or exhaust you. Sadly, that's not true. Despite my long history dealing with racism, it still hurts. It hurt when I was uninvited to a friend's birthday party in the 4th grade because of my race. It also hurt sitting in a faculty meeting as a colleague stated, "Don't we have enough Black women on the faculty?" Both incidents shook me the same way. I wasn't seen as a friend or a colleague, but was defined by my race and deemed either worthy or unworthy. When I wrote my op-ed for USA Today on normalizing racism, I stated that I was tired, so achingly tired of denying, minimizing, and dealing with racism. For most of my life, I have minimized racial slights and denied the pain so I could stay focused on my goals. Now, I've been fortunate to achieve a great deal, but it definitely came at a price. It's time to stop normalizing racism. Now, the interesting thing about the op-ed article I wrote is that I heard from countless non-minorities who could also relate. We have all suppressed pain and kept pressing our way in spite of it. I now know that sooner or later, the pain has to be addressed. So, a call to action for my minority participants who are feeling exhausted and those of you who are too busy to realize that you're exhausted, and my allies, let me just encourage you to embrace joy and not trauma. We have enough real life trauma. There's no need to invite additional trauma into your space. Be very selective about the social media, news outlets, entertainment, and viral videos you expose yourself to. Find balance. Now, don't stick your head in the sand, but don't mull over every tragedy. Giving people the benefit of the doubt and showing grace is a choice. Before trying to educate someone or give someone a piece of your mind, remember 2 things. Number 1, you cannot afford to just give away pieces of your mind, or more importantly, your PEACE piece is too valuable to give away to every ignorant person out there. Learn to pick your battles. Ask yourself, will investing my time and energy contribute to change? Or am I throwing my pearls to swine? If you don't have a relationship with the person, they probably aren't going to listen or well receive your well-crafted arguments on why something they did was racist. If you complain to the next level, whether it's administration or human resources or to an authority figure, ask yourself, what are the best and worst potential outcomes? And are you okay with either? Things won't get better if we're always silent, but appointing yourself as the person who is going to teach people how to not be racist is truly a thankless job with few benefits. Don't assume that you're immune from having biased attitudes towards others yourself. Do the hard work of diversity committees and workshops if you work for an administration that is committed to going beyond empty rhetoric. If not, there's nothing wrong with saying no. Finally, be encouraged. For in the words of Maya Angelou, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. You can't impact other people's stereotypes or how they will try to define you, but ultimately you can show and tell them who you are. To my non-minorities, either those who may feel attacked by talks of diversity and those who are true allies and everyone in between, I know that all of us are feeling fatigued from racial bias training. And the truth is, it's only useful if there's follow-up with smaller groups to interact. The ability to be in intimate spaces and have real dialogues is essential. Too often, people want a Band-Aid fix on race, and race and racism has been an issue that's been toxic for hundreds of years in this country. We need ongoing conversations. If more is called for you, will you participate in the ongoing conversations, or will you be begrudging of it? Can you hold your institutions and your groups accountable for more than holding a program once a year so they can check off a box? I've been on many diets in my life, and I have learned that healthy eating has to be managed. The same is true for bias and racism. It takes maintenance, not a quick fix. Now, I can speak from personal experience. Having a diversity of friendships, notice I didn't say colleagues or acquaintances, but real friendships is work, but so worth the investment. I know that the term privilege, particularly white privilege, turns many people off. Privilege in and of itself is a fact of life. As a graduate of Harvard Law School, I enjoy Ivy League education privilege. As a graduate of Spelman College, one of the nation's top historically Black colleges and universities, a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and other influential groups such as the Lynx and Jack and Jill, I enjoy a certain privilege within the Black middle class. As an academic, I have greatly enjoyed the privilege of maintaining a paycheck while working from home for a solid year. Do not become defensive when someone says you benefit from privilege. Many of us have different privileges. It's what you choose to do with the privilege that you have that matters. To truly stop normalizing racism, we need allies. For those of you who proudly claim that you are not racist, let me challenge you to the next level of being an ally. Proclaiming yourself not racist while staying silent in the face of racism when your voice can make a difference makes you complicit. Using your voice, your power to speak up, is how you become anti-racist. Listen with an open heart and mind. Read. There are countless books and articles on anti-racism. Talk. Race is an uncomfortable topic to discuss, but calling it out and not minimizing it is crucial. We don't need you to be colorblind or tolerant. In fact, studies have shown that trying to be colorblind doesn't work. We need allies. We learned during President Obama's administration, and we learned it during the disgraceful failed insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, that there is no such thing as a post-racial America. The FBI has been sounding the alarm that violent white supremacy is on the rise. People are emboldened to spew hate, to harass neighbors, and to try to weaponize 911 and the police. We do not need pity or even empathy. We need you to help do the work, to be an ally. People committed to racism and white supremacy will listen to you before they listen to me. Now, of course, there's always going to be pushback. When you stand for what is right, do the right thing anyway, in spite of the pushback. It's easy to sit on the sidelines, shaking your head at the minorities and their burdens, whispering a sigh of relief that it's not yourself. But as Pastor Martin Niemöller said in his infamous poem, first, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak. The time is now to stop normalizing the unacceptable. It is time to graduate from saying I have Black friends or I'm not racist to becoming a genuine ally. It's time to stop pretending that racism doesn't hurt and chip away at our peace and do something about it. It's time for allies to fight against the evil of racism. In the words of John Lewis, if you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. I want to give special thanks to Dr. Virginia Hazley and Dr. Annie Benefield Johnson for inviting me to speak today. Thank you to the Lone Star College community, particularly the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the committee members who planned this diversity summit. I do have a handout that shows a list of resources that's available. Thank you so much, and I am so happy to open this up to questions. I'll try to stop sharing my screen now, but I think Virginia has the handout, so I can close the resource list.
Yes, I have the handout, and I also have links to the videos that I'll post shortly onto the chat. I just wanted to thank you again, Professor. I find your words so moving. I've told you that already. I have a number of questions, but I also want to open it up to the chat. I think you touched on a number of things that are so compelling, especially right now. One of my questions, particularly being in a higher education institution as you, how do you overcome that resistance that some faculty members, staff, administrators may have, particularly to these pressing issues of diversity and inclusion? How do you overcome that resistance? What will your thoughts be?
It's very difficult to overcome, and it's really hard to do by yourself. So I would say to continue pressing your way and find other allies, whether they look like you or not. You know, there's so many benefits to diversity and inclusion. And for some people, they need to see how it's going to impact them or the institution, right? Bottom liner for them. It may be something that happened in the news. It may be a financial benefit, but it may be something that actually shows that actually this institution can benefit if we just take these steps, in addition to it being the right thing to do. So besides trying to appeal to their morality in terms of what's right, you also want to try to figure out a way to talk to them, to figure out what's in it for them. It's a lot of work, and it's really going to depend on having people who are not only your mentors, but your sponsors, people who behind closed doors can fight for you and can fight for diversity. And I'll also say, if you believe in diversity and you have a seat at the table, you owe it to the community, yourself, your morals, to use that position to open doors, to make a difference. Because the other side of that is you'll have people who are minorities in positions of power who won't say anything, who won't do anything. They just don't want to make any waves. And oftentimes you're in that role because of your unique perspective. So make sure you take advantage of it.
Well, I thank you for that. And if there are any comments, by the way, post them in chat. I know we still have a number of people that are participating or in the session. I want to go all the way back because, again, you touched on so many things, all the way back to your very personal story about Mr. Byrd and the murder of Mr. Byrd in Jasper, Texas. I'm curious if you or your family, in light of the political and social landscape today, do you see things better or worse?
I see things worse. I really do. And it is a very sad time for the country because people feel very emboldened now in a way that they didn't before, it feels like. Now, I can't speak because he has children, so I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Byrd family, and I'm only related by marriage. But I can say it's just a very sad time. The fact, I probably shouldn't, but I'll say something controversial. Many people refer to the former president as racist, whether you agree with that or not. The fact that so many people were able to overlook the dog whistles and the comments that could be easily construed by so many as racist was a really hard pill to swallow. It really was. And there has been more damage, I think, to race relations and where we are now than ever. We are very divided. And trying to lead with love and understanding when there's so much disinformation, when there's so much resentment, is really, really a hard time. You know, the numbers of white supremacists, because the people who murdered James Byrd, one of them got introduced to white supremacy while he was in prison. The others were already bigoted. But the rise in white supremacy began after President Obama was elected, right? As soon as he was elected, we had this increase in white supremacist groups, different groups. And that number has just increased and increased. And what was so terrifying, I think, about January 6th, from someone who knows how evil white supremacy is that all of these divergent groups found something to unify around. So you had Proud Boys with the KKK, with skinheads, these groups that usually are very independent, all of a sudden said, oh, we can all get together. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who protested, and you have a First Amendment right to protest, not to get a riot going, but to protest. I'm not saying that everyone there was racist. I'm not saying that everyone there had bad motives. But at some point, you need to look around yourselves and ask yourself, how comfortable do you feel with the company that you're keeping? Years ago in Houston, Texas, when I started with becoming an attorney, I started at a firm and then the DA's office. In order, all the judges, all the Black judges, all of them were Republicans. And one of my very dear mentors was Republican. So I actually was a registered Republican at the time. And I remember, you know, I didn't know a lot about politics. I saw good and bad things in the Republican and Democratic Party. But I remember going to a Republican event and feeling very much like an outsider, treated very much like an outsider. And I remember the dog whistles that were said by Sarah Palin. And pretty much when Colin Powell was like, I'm done, I also was done. Because there comes a point where you look at the landscape and the people around you, and you have to ask yourself, is this what I really stand for? Right? Or are people using some of the things I stand for? I'm certainly a religious person. Are they trying to use that against me and twist my faith into something that is not? I hope I answered your question. I kind of gave a long way around.
Well, you absolutely did. Dr. Benefield has a couple questions, and then if we have time, I'd love to come back to that. Dr. Benefield first asks, what steps can Lone Star College Tomball do beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars?
So diversity, equity, inclusion seminars are the first step, right? It's the first step to getting people to talk and dialogue. In going forward, you need to figure out how can we go further to helping people understand. And that may be through trying to incorporate issues such as race and inclusion in class and coursework, because, you know, racism and race is an issue everywhere, honestly. It can be incorporated in a class discussion. It can be in having more workshops and seminars. It can be in having small group discussions. But it all starts with administration, and then it can filter down to students. Oftentimes, students are more eager to learn about diversity, and you'll have people who are in positions of power who are more resistant. Or you'll also have people who are just nervous. I remember there's a great Supreme Court case, Walker v. City of Birmingham. And it correlates with Dr. Martin Luther King's letter that he wrote from a Birmingham jail. And we have two Supreme Court justices writing an opinion and a dissenting opinion. And the way that they described what happened was completely distinct. And one talked about the complainant is a Negro minister. And the other one started with, on June 24th, the defendants violated an injunction, right? So they even the way they used language was very, very different. And I think it's a powerful way to talk about persuasion, and also within the context of race and history. I had a colleague who saw the word Negro and she's like, oh no, I can't use that case. I just wouldn't feel comfortable. And so we need to have some discussions about, you know, feeling comfortable talking about things, because sometimes when we ignore them, we make it worse. The same is true with our classroom management. If race comes up between the student body and you're nervous about how to handle it, so you just try to move on, oftentimes one of the people involved, usually the minority student, is going to feel slighted because you didn't stand up, you didn't say anything. The same is true when we have big things that happen in the news, like George Floyd. For the law school community, and I don't know what Lone Star did, but for the law school community, hundreds of deans around the country joined in a statement condemning the racial violence and death of George Floyd. So even things like that send a message to your students, to the faculty. So when you talk about how do we go forward, you've got to make sure you're doing more than lip service, right? You've got to make sure that it is a priority in all of the decisions you're making. You've got to be intentional about it, because if you're not intentional about it, solutions are not going to just come upon themselves out thin air.
So thank you for that. It sounds like, without putting words in your mouth, what you would advocate is that change, particularly when it comes to higher education, is top down, or there's going to be a greater effect top down rather than ground up. Would you say that's accurate?
I'd say that's very accurate, but if top down is missing, students can definitely organize and demand change. There's nothing wrong with student advocacy and getting together and insisting, hey, we want these types of classes. Hey, we need to discuss this more. And sooner or later, those students are going to come upon some more allies in better positions of power. And that can also end up having change.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that as well. I'm going to switch gears. And you had another life, or had a different role as a prosecutor, as well as an associate judge. And because part of your presentation did talk about criminal justice and the mistreatment, the disproportionate, particularly mistreatment of African-American males in terms of law enforcement, how would you define defunding the police? So that's a hot topic issue, right? How would you define it, and why, particularly given your role in criminal justice, would you say that we would support it?
Okay, so if anyone wants to read any of my op-eds, you can go to NajariRutledge.com, and I've written an op-ed on defund the police, which will give you some more in-depth information on that. I think that is the most ridiculous marketing thing that has ever happened. As soon as I heard the term defund the police, I was just horrified and knew it was going to be twisted and turned against the good intentions. What people really mean by defund the police is not to fire all the police, is not to we don't need police anymore. That's ridiculous. In fact, I think if you did a study of all minority communities, they would say, no, we understand that the police are valuable, they're important. There are many minority police members. Many of us have family members or have dated members of police. I am actually very pro law enforcement. I am not pro bad law enforcement, right? And so what we're really saying is, let's stop militarizing the police. For instance, if you have a low-level drug case, let's say it's an undercover buy bust, police knock on the door, they see someone has drugs, they get a search warrant. Why are you going into that low-level buy bust? Because, a felony is a gram of cocaine. A gram is basically a sugar packet. Why are you going into that person's house, kicking the door down, using flashbang grenades for a small amount of drugs? It's the militarization of police, the SWAT teams, that's a problem. There's also a problem with asking police to do things that they don't want to do, and they shouldn't be put in the position to do. The police aren't meant to be mental health experts. It's not really fair to call upon them to do that work. But because we don't know how to deal with our mentally ill, all the time we just call 911 like it's the cure-all. It should not be the cure-all, because it not only puts the police in a bad position, it puts the citizens in a bad position as well. So we've heard lots of horror stories where the mentally ill were hurt because of a welfare check that went wrong. So the police need some more support. Training is an issue, but if you look at it, I don't know if you realize it, but there's actually no centralized force where a bad police officer gets fired and they just decide to go over across the state or across the county, because we have like over 100 policing agencies in Houston. I don't know if everyone realizes how many policing agencies we have. You can just get another job at an agency, and those agencies may never talk to each other. So there's so much reform that needs to happen, but it's not necessarily about abolishing the police. And I have to give it to the political strategists who are able to twist that around to make it seem that certain groups were just anti-police. It's not anti-police, it's anti-police brutality. Most police do a good job, but it's not just about a few bad apples either. There's a culture that needs to be dealt with. And the last thing I'll say is what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota. Years before then, Philando Castile was killed in Minnesota. And as a result, President Obama authorized millions of dollars to go to 6 cities, including Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, to focus on community policing, reform, and training. And yet we still have George Floyd. So we've got to come up with some creative solutions and not trying to use the same old thing or out of desperation, do some ridiculous thing like abolish the police or antagonize the police where they assume that everyone's against them when we really need reform. So what we really need is more communication and dialogue.
I absolutely love your energy in responding to that. I really appreciate that. We are actually winding down, Professor. One thing I want to tell participants is shortly I will put a link to provide feedback for the summit as well as this session. And I will enter that link in just a minute. However, you're not supposed to actually provide feedback, go to SurveyMonkey until 1:10 p.m. So how about that, students? Okay, everybody's a student. Follow instructions, 1:10 p.m. And I will submit that in just a minute. Professor, I'm just curious as we wind down, thank you again, because you touched on so many important aspects in your presentation. What would you like the takeaway to be for our participants? If there's one or maybe more than one, what would your takeaways be?
My takeaways would be encouraged. Many of you are doing the hard work and you're feeling tired and devalued, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel and your work makes a difference. My takeaway would be allyship. We need people to join with us if we're ever going to address the issue of racism. My takeaway is white nationalism and seeing those Confederate flags and the nooses on January 6th is not just an isolated incident. We need to be paying really good attention because they can do some really harmful things. And finally, racism hurts. It hurts all of us. It hurts our community. It hurts our nation. And we have got to have these difficult conversations, as difficult as they may be, if we're going to ever have long-lasting change and stop normalizing and acting like this is no big deal. It is a big deal, and it certainly shouldn't be considered normal.
I thank you again. I'm so appreciative, and this has just been a wonderful journey for me as well. So to my participants, thank you.
We have 2 minutes. Is there anybody else who needs me?
You know, good point. We do have 2 minutes because I've got a lot more questions.
Virginia, could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Professor, that was just an outstanding presentation. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I don't know how the rest of the seminar is going to top that. I have a brief comment and a question. Briefly, I moved here in 2000 from Ohio. And of course, that was right after, that was just 2 years after what happened to James Byrd. And I'll tell you, all my friends and family, I'm gonna use language which might be a little harsh. I hope you folks are ready. All my family and friends said, "Harlan, you sure you want to go down to Dragon Nigga country?" And that's how Texas was being portrayed to the whole rest of the country. So my question for you then is, how do you respond to white privilege deniers, to people who think that acknowledging discriminatory benefits is an attack upon white people?
So notice in my presentation, I started talking about my own biases, right? And I admitted that we all are impacted by bias. And I took the test and I was given the test, the implicit bias test, and the link. Because if you just jump into racism, you're right, people are liable to get really defensive. You know, I mean, I think it's almost treated as worse than calling someone a liar. You call someone a racist and they're ready to fight because they're thinking you're calling them KKK members. And that's not the case. Many people have a hard time wrapping their minds around the fact that we all, from living in this country, have some things that we're not even aware of that we're thinking. And one of the things I try to emphasize in my presentation as well is a lot of times this is unintentional, right? It's not that you're intending to hurt people, but if you really care about people, if you really want to be anti-racist, which is the next step to saying I have Black friends, you need to take the time to put down the defensiveness and learn. And if you don't feel comfortable doing it in a dialogue with others, there's so many books and videos and resources for you. So in the comfort of your own home, you can do the work. And it's hard work. When I took the test, I was shocked. I was like, oh, I'm going to get 100. I don't have any biases. Not true. We all have them.
Thank you, Professor.
Of course.
So one thing I'll get with you afterwards, Professor, is to get the link for this test. I think it would be.
Oh, it's in the resource document I gave you.
It's in the resource that I am going to post. Okay,
yes,
got it.
If you post it, it's actually the first thing. It says implicit bias test. And if they do a search, just do implicit bias Harvard. Harvard University did the test and you can find it. And you can look for colorism. You can look on biases against weight, weapons, everything.
Oh, bias against weight, huh? Okay.
Yep. That's a real bias too.
Yes, ma'am. All right. Do we have any other questions? Anything else that anyone would like to ask? Anything? You guys are welcome to leave this session. Another session will begin shortly. I'm going to stay on, however, and I'm just going to ask the professor to stay on as you guys exit. So safely exit the room. Thank you again. You've gotten so many wonderful compliments, Professor, if you haven't already read them on the chat. But I will definitely be posting the sources and the links. Does anyone have anything they'd like to shout out or say? Oh, we've got some reactions. Thanks, Chinda.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you.
Look at all your claps.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.